Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be stepping into the complex world of spiritual organizations, focusing on a specific group. I would see Misha Chaitanya, also known as Sef Chaitanya Mission. It's led by a figure named Cris Butler. And you send over a collection of materials, internal documents, lecture transcripts, personal accounts, that raise some really intriguing and frankly concerning questions about the inner workings of this group and Butler's influence.
Yeah. And you know what makes this deep dive particularly fascinating is that we're not just looking at surface teachings, we're peeling back the layers to examine the potential for manipulation within the organization.
Right, because on the face of it, a lot of spiritual groups share common themes, seeking enlightenment, connection to a higher power, that kind of thing. But what sets this apart is a suggestion that there might be a darker side to how IoT operates.
Absolutely. To understand that potential for darkness, I think it's crucial to start with a bit of context. Cris Butler, often referred to as Jagadguru Siddheswarapananda Paramahansa, founded IoT back in the 1970s. He draws from various traditions, including Hinduism and yoga, and presents himself as a spiritual master.
So he's positioned as an authority figure, a
Yeah.
guide to enlightenment. And that's where the potential for manipulation comes in, right? When you have a figure who's seen as having all the answers, it can create an imbalance of power.
Exactly. That's what we'll be exploring as we delve into these sources. One of the most striking documents you've provided is this outline of Butler's unwritten rules. Now, some of them, like not criticizing the guru, might seem fairly typical in a guru-centered organization, but there are others that are a bit more, let's say, eyebrow-raising.
Yeah. The one that immediately caught my eye was the rule about not seeking out or even listening to any negative information about Butler or the group. It almost feels like a deliberate attempt to control the narrative, to prevent any dissenting voices from being heard.
What's interesting is how this rule, when combined with others, creates a very specific environment. Within the group, there's a strong emphasis on obedience and submission to Butler's authority. This, coupled with restrictions on information and outside contact, can lead to isolation and make individuals more susceptible to manipulation.
It's like building a wall around members, both physically and mentally, cutting them off from anything that might challenge the group's ideology.
And when you consider the potential consequences of breaking these rules, as hinted at in some of the personal accounts you provided, it paints a rather disturbing picture. People who dared to question or criticize Butler faced isolation, shunning, and even accusations of spiritual deviance.
So it's not just about adhering to a set of guidelines. It's about creating a climate of fear where people are afraid to speak out or even think critically about what's happening around them.
Precisely. And this fear becomes a powerful tool for control. It keeps people in line, it discourages dissent, and it ensures that Butler's authority remains unchallenged.
Let's move on to this lecture transcript from Tapasya Das, a high-ranking member of the group. There's a section where he talks about leaders imitating Butler and resorting to psychological terror to maintain control. It's pretty chilling stuff. What are your thoughts on this, and how does it connect to the larger picture we're building here?
Well, firstly, it's important to note that Tapasya Das, despite being a prominent figure within IBOT, has also been critical of certain aspects of the organization, so even within the group, there seem to be dissenting voices, although they might be suppressed or marginalized.
Right, so it's not a monolithic entity where everyone blindly follows. But getting back to that phrase, psychological terror, it suggests a deliberate use of fear and intimidation to manipulate people's behavior.
And when you connect this to Butler's unwritten rules, it's not hard to see how those rules could be used to create that atmosphere of terror. The rule against criticizing Butler, for example, can be wielded as a weapon to silence anyone who expresses doubts or concerns.
And the rule about avoiding negative information reinforces the idea that anything critical of Butler or the group is inherently dangerous or wrong. It creates this us versus them mentality, where anyone who disagrees is automatically seen as an enemy.
This ties into a concept we see frequently in studies of cults and manipulative groups: information control. By limiting the information members are exposed to, the leadership can shape their perceptions and maintain a narrative that justifies their authority and practices.
It's like building a reality bubble, where everything outside is considered hostile or corrupted, and within that bubble, the leader's word becomes absolute truth. It's a very effective way to isolate people and make them dependent on the group for their sense of reality.
And that dependence, that sense of needing the group for validation and guidance, becomes a key factor in making people vulnerable to manipulation. They start to lose their ability to think critically, to trust their own judgment, and to question what they're being told.
This brings us to another fascinating document you shared, Butler's letter on surrender. It's quite striking in its language and the message it conveys about the individual's relationship to Butler and the divine.
Yes. This letter is crucial in understanding the psychological dynamics at play within IoT. Butler paints a picture of the individual as inherently flawed, sinful, and desperately in need of his guidance. He uses very strong language, describing himself and his followers as lower than the straw in the street.
It's almost like a deliberate attempt to break down people's sense of self-worth, to make them feel completely dependent on him for salvation.
And what's particularly concerning is how he ties this self-deprecation to the concept of love for Krishna. He suggests that the only way to truly love Krishna is to completely submit to his authority and accept your own worthlessness.
It's a strange juxtaposition, isn't it? Equating spiritual love with self-hatred. It seems to go against the grain of many spiritual traditions that emphasize compassion and self-acceptance.
That's a really important point. Butler's message of surrender, while framed in spiritual terms, has a very specific psychological impact. It fosters a sense of guilt and shame, making people more receptive to his authority and less likely to question his teachings or actions.
It's like a recipe for creating followers who are both devoted and deeply insecure, constantly seeking validation and approval from Butler.
Exactly. And that insecurity, that need for external validation, becomes a powerful tool for control. It makes people less likely to assert their own needs or boundaries, more willing to accept even unreasonable demands, and more fearful of the consequences of disobedience.
This all paints a rather unsettling picture, wouldn't you say? We've got these unwritten rules creating an environment of fear and control, a leader using language to manipulate people's emotions and self-perception, and a system that seems designed to foster dependence and discourage critical thinking.
It certainly raises some serious red flags, and as we delve deeper into these sources, we'll be exploring how these manipulative tactics can have a devastating impact on individuals, their relationships, and their sense of self. But we'll save that for part 2 of our deep dive.
Picking up where we left off, I'm curious about something. We've been talking about Butler's letter on surrender, and how it seems designed to create a sense of dependence and insecurity. But wouldn't a genuine spiritual path involve some degree of surrender? Isn't there a difference between healthy surrender and the kind of manipulation we're discussing?
That's a really insightful question, and you're right, the concept of surrender exists in many spiritual traditions, but there's a fundamental difference between surrendering to a higher principle, a divine force, and surrendering to a human being who claims to embody that force.
So it's about the object of your surrender, who or what you're placing your trust in.
Exactly. In a healthy spiritual practice, surrender is about letting go of ego, of the illusion of control, and opening yourself to something greater than yourself. But in a manipulative context, surrender becomes about giving up your autonomy, your critical thinking, to an individual who can then exploit that trust for their own gain.
And it seems like Butler is very deliberately blurring those lines, using spiritual language to mask what's essentially a power play. He talks about surrendering to Krishna. But in practice, the surrender is directed toward him, as the self-proclaimed guru.
And that's where the danger lies. When a spiritual leader positions themselves as the sole mediator between you and the divine, they create a situation where questioning their authority becomes tantamount to questioning the divine itself.
It's like that line in the Pufne Mafen Jazasati Sekti-Butler.pdf document that talks about how everything from Butler is considered absolute truth, while anything from outside the group is automatically suspect, and that creates this impermeable barrier where critical thinking is essentially shut down.
Yes. And that's a hallmark of what we call a cult mindset. It's about creating an unquestioning loyalty to the leader and the group's ideology, often at the expense of individual well-being and critical thinking.
And when you combine that with the rule about shunning anyone who leaves or criticizes the group, it creates a very powerful social pressure to conform. It's not just about believing what you're told. It's about actively participating in the silencing of dissent.
What's fascinating here is how these seemingly small, even innocuous rules can have a ripple effect, impacting not just individuals' beliefs, but their entire social fabric. People become afraid to express doubts, even to themselves, because they risk losing their entire community, their support system.
It's almost like a self-reinforcing cycle of isolation and control. The rules create an environment where people are afraid to speak out, and that silence then reinforces the power of those who are in control.
And within that environment, it becomes very difficult to recognize, let alone resist, manipulation. You're constantly being told that your doubts are signs of spiritual weakness, that your critical thinking is an egotistical obstacle to enlightenment.
And remember how in Butler's letter he talks about being afraid that Krishna will not be there, that Krishna will not love us. It's almost like he's weaponizing people's spiritual aspirations, their desire for connection to something greater, and using it to create a climate of fear and dependency.
And let's not forget about the potential for psychological harm. That arises from this constant self-deprecation, this message that you're inherently flawed and unworthy. It can erode people's self-esteem, making them more dependent on the group for validation, and less likely to assert their own needs or boundaries.
It's almost like a form of spiritual gaslighting, where you're constantly being told that your perceptions are wrong, your feelings are invalid, and the only truth is what the leader tells you.
And the longer you're exposed to that kind of messaging, the more it can warp your sense of self. You start to internalize those negative beliefs, to see yourself through the lens of the group's ideology.
And that's where it becomes really difficult to break free, isn't it? Because you've essentially been conditioned to doubt your own judgment, to see the world through the distorted lens created by the group.
This raises an important question, though. If this is so insidious and pervasive, how do people end up in these situations in the first place? Why would someone willingly subject themselves to this kind of manipulation?
Well, I think it's crucial to remember that most people don't join these groups with the intention of being manipulated. They're often drawn in by genuine spiritual aspirations, a desire for connection, meaning, and purpose.
And manipulative groups are very good at exploiting those desires. They offer a sense of belonging, a clear path to enlightenment, a charismatic leader who seems to have all the answers.
It's almost like a bait and switch, isn't it? You're lured in by the promise of spiritual fulfillment, but then you find yourself trapped in a system designed to control and exploit you.
And that's why it's so important to be aware of the red flags, to be critical of the messages we're receiving, and to trust our gut instincts. If something feels wrong, if you feel pressured or manipulated, it's okay to question, to disagree, and even to walk away.
You know, as we're talking about this, I keep thinking about this term sahaduja that was mentioned in one of the sources. It's not very well explained, but it seems to relate to some kind of esoteric spiritual practice that can be used for manipulation. Can you shed some light on this concept and how it might relate to what we're seeing in IWT?
Sahaduja is a complex and often misunderstood concept. It's a term that originated in tantric traditions and refers to a specific path of spiritual practice that emphasizes the union of opposites, often symbolized by the union of male and female energies.
Okay, so it's about seeking enlightenment through a kind of embodied spirituality, as opposed to purely intellectual or ascetic practices.
Exactly. And within that framework, there are certain practices and techniques that can be very powerful, but also potentially dangerous if misused.
So it's not inherently bad or manipulative.
Yeah.
But it has the potential to be used in that way.
Precisely. And that's where the connection to Butler and Iwatu becomes interesting. It's not about saying that he's definitively using Sahaduijan techniques, but rather that some of the principles and dynamics we see in Iwatu, the emphasis on surrender, the use of guilt and fear, the potential for sexual exploitation, align with some of the ways in which Sahaduja can be distorted and used for manipulation.
So it's like a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most profound spiritual teachings can be twisted and used for nefarious purposes.
And that's why discernment is so crucial. It's not enough to simply accept teachings blindly, even from someone who presents themselves as an enlightened master. We had a responsibility to question, to analyze, and to ensure that our spiritual journey is truly serving our highest good, and not someone else's agenda.
This brings us to a very disturbing part of this deep dive, the allegations of criminal activity within IWT. The pre-step z-secta-secta.pdf document paints a very dark picture, suggesting that the organization might be involved in everything from financial irregularities to harboring criminal agents.
Yes, and while it's important to remember that these are allegations, not proven facts that can't be ignored, the level of detail in the document, the specific accusations, the potential connection to Butler's business dealings, it all raises some very serious concerns.
And if those allegations are true, it means that the manipulation we've been discussing goes far beyond spiritual exploitation. It extends into the realm of criminal activity.
And what's particularly disturbing is how the manipulative tactics we've already discussed, the information control, the fear of speaking out, the unquestioning loyalty to Butler, create the perfect environment for hiding such activities.
It's like a system designed to protect those in power, no matter what they're doing. And for the individuals within that system, it can be incredibly difficult to break free, to even recognize that they're being exploited, let alone seek help.
This raises a crucial question. What can someone do if they find themselves in a situation like this? If they suspect they're being manipulated or exploited within a spiritual group?
I imagine it can feel incredibly isolating and frightening, especially if you've been taught to doubt your own judgment and fear the consequences of speaking out.
Absolutely, and that's why it's so crucial to reach out for support, talking to trusted friends or family members, seeking professional help from a therapist or counselor who specializes in cults and manipulative groups. These are essential steps in breaking free from the grip of manipulation.
And it's important to remember that you're not alone. Many people find themselves in these situations, often drawn in by genuine spiritual aspirations. The key is to break the cycle of silence and shame.
Right. By talking about these experiences, by sharing our stories, we can raise awareness, help others who might be in similar situations, and hold these organizations accountable.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of situations, knowledge and connection can be sources of strength and liberation.
And in the final part of our deep dive, we'll delve deeper into these themes, exploring the specific steps individuals can take to protect themselves, seek help,
Yeah.
and reclaim their autonomy.
We've been unpacking some really heavy stuff: manipulation tactics, psychological impact, even allegations of criminal activity. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all this, especially if you're trying to make sense of your own experiences or those of someone you care about. So in this final part, I'd like to shift gears a bit and focus on empowerment. What can someone do if they're feeling trapped or manipulated within a spiritual group or any kind of controlling environment?
That's a crucial question, and I'm glad we're addressing it. The first and most important step is simply acknowledging that something isn't right. Trust your gut instincts. If you're feeling pressured, controlled, or like your boundaries are being violated, don't ignore those feelings. Often our intuition is trying to tell us something important.
It can be hard to trust those instincts, though, especially if you've been conditioned to doubt yourself or fear the consequences of speaking out. Remember how Butler's unwritten rules discouraged critical thinking and questioning? Those kinds of tactics can really erode a person's confidence in their own judgment.
Absolutely. And that's why seeking external support is so vital. Talk to someone you trust outside the group, a friend, a family member, a therapist, or a counselor who specializes in cults and manipulative groups. There are also organizations like the International Cultic Studies Association that offer resources and support.
That makes sense. Having that outside perspective can help you see the situation more clearly, to realize that your feelings are valid and that you're not alone in experiencing this.
It's also important to start gathering information. Read about manipulation tactics, learn about the red flags of abusive relationships, and research the specific group or organization you're involved with. Knowledge is power, and the more you understand about how manipulation works, the better equipped you'll be to break free.
Speaking of red flags, the Tree Steps Secta.pdf document raises some really alarming ones: financial irregularities, potential criminal activity, even accusations that IWPUT might be harboring criminal agents. That's a whole other level of manipulation and exploitation.
It certainly adds a layer of complexity, and it underscores the potential consequences of remaining silent. If these allegations are true, it means that people's lives and well-being could be at risk. And remember, silence often protects the abuser, not the abused.
So what can someone do if they suspect criminal activity within a group that can feel incredibly intimidating and dangerous?
It is. And it's important to prioritize safety. Don't confront the situation directly, or try to gather evidence on your own. Instead, contact law enforcement or a trusted organization that can help you navigate the situation safely and effectively.
We've talked a lot about the psychological impact of manipulation, how it can erode self-esteem and create a sense of dependence. What are some of the long-term effects that people might struggle with even after leaving a controlling group?
Recovering from manipulation can be a long and challenging process. Many people experience trauma, anxiety, depression, and difficulty trusting themselves or others. They may struggle with guilt, shame, and a sense of betrayal, especially if they were deeply invested in the group's ideology.
It's like the ground has shifted beneath them, and they're having to rebuild their entire worldview. That's a lot to grapple with.
It is. And that's why therapy and support groups can be so beneficial. It's a safe space to process those experiences, to understand the dynamics of manipulation, and to develop healthy coping mechanisms.
And it's a reminder that healing takes time. There's no quick fix, no magic wand to erase the pain and confusion.
It's about patience, self-compassion, and allowing yourself to grieve the loss of what you believed in, the relationships you may have left behind, and the sense of self that was eroded by the manipulation.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. From seemingly innocuous, unwritten rules to disturbing allegations of criminal activity. It's a stark reminder that manipulation can take many forms, and that it can happen anywhere, even in spaces that claim to be about love, enlightenment, or spiritual growth.
And you know, I think the most important takeaway is this. You have the right to question, to disagree, and to protect yourself. Your well-being, your autonomy, your sense of self, these are precious and worth fighting for.
Knowledge, as they say, is power, and in this case, knowledge about manipulation, about the tactics used by controlling groups, can be the key to freeing ourselves and helping others.
So we encourage you to continue exploring this topic, to ask questions, to share your experiences, and to never stop thinking critically, because ultimately the journey towards true liberation begins with reclaiming our own minds and hearts.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, you are not alone, and there is help available. We hope this conversation has empowered you to trust your instincts, seek support, and choose your own path.